The report of the pistol fractured the heavy silence of the Arizona dusk, snapping through the dry air like a dry branch under a heavy boot. Elias Thorne hauled back on the reins of his roan gelding, the leather biting into his gloved hands as the animal danced nervously beneath him. 13 years had dissolved since the final bloody days of the Civil War, yet the instincts forged in the fires of Antietam and the wilderness remained branded onto his soul, closer than his own shadow. His hand hovered over the ivory handle of his revolver, not out of conscious thought, but muscle memory, honed by years of surviving when others fell. Another shot rang out, followed by a terrifying, high-pitched scream that tore through the canyon, a woman's cry for help. Elias didn't hesitate. He spurred the horse into a gallop, the animal's hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth as they wove through the labyrinth of red sandstone that rose around them like the ruined pillars of a forgotten cathedral. Elias was a man carved from the landscape itself, 45 years of grit and survival etched into a face that rarely smiled, marked by a jagged scar tracing the line of his jaw, a permanent souvenir from a bayonet skirmish in Virginia. He crested the limestone ridge, the dying sun casting long, bruised shadows of purple and orange across the scrubland, and looked down into the basin. 2 riders were circling a lone figure on the ground, their movements predatory and cruel, like coyotes tightening a noose around a stray calf. The woman on foot was nimble, darting between boulders, but the men were closing the distance, one of them raising a long-barreled pistol to end the game. Elias drew his weapon, the weight of the steel familiar and grounding, and fired. The bullet found its mark instantly. The gunman was lifted from his saddle by the impact, dead before he hit the dust, while his companion, panic seizing his courage, wheeled his horse around and scrambled blindly into the darkening chaparral. Elias kept his weapon trained on the fleeing rider until the dust settled, then guided his mount down the scree-covered slope with practiced caution. He dismounted near the fallen assailant, confirming the man was gone, before turning his attention to the survivor. She stood with her back against a boulder, her chest heaving with exertion, yet her posture remained defiant rather than cowering. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, dressed in a dusty cotton dress that had seen better days, her raven hair braided intricately with beads of bone and turquoise, her eyes, dark and assessing, locked onto his with an intensity that unsettled him. There was fear there, certainly, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, calculating intelligence. "Are you injured?" Elias asked, his voice rough from days of silence on the trail as he holstered his revolver. She shook her head slowly, scanning the horizon for the second man. "Those men," she said, her English accented with the cadence of the Apache tongue, "they are thieves who have been raiding the southern settlements. Tonight, they sought more than just horses." Elias nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken implication. The frontier was a lawless place where the strong devoured the weak, and he had seen enough cruelty to know exactly what fate she had just escaped. "Do you have a sanctuary? A place to go?" She gestured toward the distant northern mesas, now silhouetted against the coming night. "My people are there. It is a long walk in the dark, and the spirits of the night are restless, but I have endured worse journeys." She paused, stepping away from the rock, her gaze softening slightly as she looked at him. "I am Chenoa. Among my people, a life saved creates a bond that cannot be severed by time or distance. I will remember this, Elias Thorne." Before he could ask how she knew who he was, she slipped away into the twilight, moving as silently as smoke, leaving him alone with the wind and the dead man. A week later, the memory of the canyon encounter had been buried under the crushing weight of running the Iron Ridge Ranch. The territory was in the chokehold of a relentless drought. The creeks were turning to cracked mud, and the heat pressed down on the valley like a physical weight. Elias stood by the main corral, addressing a gathering of 30 sun-baked ranch hands, his voice steady as he outlined the desperate plan to drive the herd east toward the high pastures. "We move at first light," he was saying, pointing toward the ridgeline. "We can't wait for rain that isn't coming." The sentence was never finished. A sudden, crushing pressure slammed into the center of his chest, as if a mule had kicked him squarely in the sternum. The world didn't just spin, it tilted violently on its axis, the vibrant blues of the sky and the reds of the earth bleeding into a suffocating gray. He reached out blindly for the corral fence, his fingers grasping at empty air and his knees buckled. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs, but he couldn't inhale to replace it. A roar filled his ears, drowning out the shouts of his men. Around him, the ranch hands froze, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the sight. Elias Thorne was the bedrock of this valley, a man who seemed indestructible. To see him crumble was like watching a mountain collapse. Silas Vane, the ranch's foreman, pushed his way through the paralyzed crowd. Silas was a man of sharp angles and bitter grudges, a former Confederate officer who harbored a deep, festering hatred for Elias's practice of paying fair wages to Mexican and indigenous workers. Silas looked down at the rancher's prone form, noting the blue tint coloring his lips, and a cold, opportunistic light flickered in his pale eyes. "Back up!" Silas barked, his voice cracking with feigned concern that masked a dark exhilaration. "Give him air! Don't touch him!" He knew what he was seeing, and he knew that if nature took its course, Iron Ridge would be left leaderless and vulnerable. Silas Vane watched with grim satisfaction as the life seemed to ebb from his employer, but he hadn't accounted for the shadow that detached itself from the gloom of the stables. Chenoa had been watching the ranch for days, sleeping in the haylofts, bound by the ancient code of her people to repay the life debt she owed. Seeing Elias fall, she sprinted across the packed earth, her bare feet making no sound. She dropped to her knees beside his lifeless body, ignoring the stunned gasps of the cowboys. She placed her ear to his chest. Silence. The spirit was leaving the vessel. Immediately she began the rhythm her grandmother, a medicine woman of great renown, had taught her. The forceful compression of the chest to mimic the beating heart, the breath of life shared between the living and the dead. She pressed down hard, her small hands forceful against his sternum. 1, 2, 3, she counted in her native tongue, then pinched his nose and breathed into his mouth. "Get away from him!" Silas roared, the spell of his opportunism broken by her interference. "Get that savage off of him! She's cursing him!" He didn't just shout, he acted. He swung the butt of his heavy Winchester rifle, driving it viciously into Chenoa's back. The impact was sickening, a dull crack that sounded like snapping firewood. Chenoa cried out, collapsing forward into the dirt, pain exploding along her spine like liquid fire. "Witchcraft!" Silas screamed, turning to the confused men to rally them against her. "She's trying to steal his soul! Look at her!" Despite the agony that blinded her vision, Chenoa dragged herself back up. "The debt must be paid," a voice whispered in her mind. "He saved you. You must save him." She forced her trembling hands back onto Elias's chest and pumped again. Thump, thump, thump. Silas raised the rifle for a killing blow, his face twisted in a rictus of hate. But suddenly Elias's body convulsed. A ragged, desperate gasp tore from his throat as his heart stuttered back into a rhythm. He was alive. The miraculous revival of Elias Thorne sent a shockwave of superstitious fear through the gathered men, but for Silas Vane it was a catastrophe. His chance at seizing control was slipping away with every breath Elias took. He had to control the narrative immediately. He grabbed Chenoa by her hair, hauling her up despite her scream of agony from her shattered ribs. "You see what she did?" Silas bellowed, shaking her like a rag doll in front of the confused ranch hands. "She attacked him while he was down, trying to finish the job with her heathen magic." Chenoa tried to speak, to explain she had restarted his heart, but Silas backhanded her across the face, splitting her lip. "Get her off this property," he ordered two of his most loyal hired guns, men who didn't ask questions. "If she comes back, shoot her on sight. Tell the town the Apache attacked Mr. Thorne." As they dragged the injured woman toward the wasteland beyond the fence line, Silas looked down at the unconscious Elias, who was now being lifted by the other workers. The boss was alive, yes, but he was weak, incapacitated, and would be bedridden for days. That was enough time. Silas marched to the ranch office, his mind racing. He sat at Elias's desk and drafted a telegram to the leader of a notorious rustling gang across the border. "The lion is asleep," he wrote. "The gate is open. Bring your riders." He folded the paper, a cruel smile touching his lips. He had failed to let Elias die, but he would ensure that by the time the rancher woke up, there would be nothing left of his empire but ash and dust. 3 days vanished into a fevered void of darkness and disjointed dreams before Elias Thorne clawed his way back to consciousness. He woke to the sound of wind rattling the heavy oak shutters of his bedroom, a sound that felt lonely and ominous in the afternoon heat. His body felt as though it had been trampled by a stampede, His chest was a cage of dull, throbbing agony, and every breath was a labor that required conscious effort. But while his body was broken, his mind snapped back into focus with the predatory sharpness of a man who has spent his life listening for the snap of a twig in the dark. Something was wrong. The air in the room was stale, smelling faintly of carbolic acid and stale tobacco, but beneath that was the acrid scent of wood smoke that didn't belong in the main house. A doctor from the nearby township, a man named Prickly Dr. Abernathy, was hovering over him, wiping a cool cloth across his forehead. When Elias croaked out a demand to know who had saved him in the corral, Abernathy's eyes slid away, refusing to meet the rancher's gaze. "Your men, Mr. Thorne," the doctor lied, his voice too loud and too cheerful. "They got you inside just in time, kept you stable until I could arrive." Elias narrowed his eyes. He had been a scout during the war, surviving 4 years behind enemy lines by reading the deceit in men's faces. This doctor was lying. Elias feigned sleep until the man left the room, his mind racing. He remembered the crushing weight on his chest, the darkness, and then a rhythm, a pressure, a woman's voice counting in a language that wasn't English. He waited until the moon rose high and the house fell silent before he gritted his teeth against the screaming pain in his ribs and swung his legs over the side of the bed. He had marched 30 miles on a shattered ankle after Chancellorsville. He could walk across his own ranch house. Elias moved through the shadowed corridors of Iron Ridge like a ghost haunting his own life. The house was empty of the usual servants, the silence heavy and suffocating. He made his way out the back door and toward the main barn where the incident had occurred, staying low to the ground, using the shadows as armor. The main yard was strangely deserted, lacking the usual night watchman he paid good wages to patrol the perimeter. When he reached the spot near the water trough where he had collapsed, he knelt in the dust, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There, half buried in the churned earth, he found the truth. It was a small, torn strip of cotton fabric embroidered with a specific pattern of beadwork, turquoise and bone. It was the same pattern he had seen on the dress of the woman in the canyon. Chenoa. She had been here. She had saved him. The memory of the doctor's lie turned to ash in his mouth. Elias pocketed the fabric and made his way to the bunkhouse, bypassing the main door to tap on a small rear window. It was the quarters of Mateo, the 70-year-old vaquero who had ridden with Elias's father. Mateo was the moral compass of the ranch, a man whose loyalty was as deep as the roots of the mesquite trees. When Mateo opened the window and saw his employer standing there, pale as death but upright, he crossed himself and wept silently. He pulled Elias into the shadows and spilled the dark truth that had festered for 3 days. He spoke of Chenoa's bravery, her desperate CPR that brought Elias back from the brink, and the brutal savagery of Silas Vane, who had crushed her spine with a rifle butt and driven her out into the wasteland as a witch. Mateo's confession didn't stop at the assault. The old man's hands trembled as he reached under his mattress and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a draft of a telegram he had salvaged from the waste bin in the main office. "Silas sent this 2 hours after you fell," Mateo whispered, terror edging his voice. "He has hired new men, strangers. They wear their guns low, and they do not work the cattle. They watch the road." Elias took the paper and held it up to the sliver of moonlight. It was addressed to a known rustler syndicate operating near the border. "The old man is down. The herd is unguarded. Come take your share." The betrayal was absolute. Silas wasn't just stealing cattle. He was orchestrating the systematic dismantling of everything Elias had built, using the rancher's incapacity as the key to open the gates. A cold, hard rage settled over Elias, displacing the pain in his chest. It was a familiar feeling, the cold clarity of battle. He thanked Mateo and gave him a single order. "Stay low. Gather the men we can trust, the ones who haven't been bought, and keep them ready. I have a debt to pay before I can deal with Silas." Elias returned to the main house, but not to his bed. He went to his study and unlocked the gun cabinet. He took down his Winchester repeating rifle, checking the action with mechanical precision. He strapped on his gun belt, the heavy Colt settling against his hip like an old friend. He packed a saddlebag with medical supplies, laudanum, clean bandages, surgical spirits, and his father's heavy Bowie knife. He didn't saddle a horse from the main barn where he might be seen. Instead, he walked a mile to the south pasture to catch a grazing mare, wincing with every step, fueled only by adrenaline and the burning need to balance the scales. The ride to the northern mesas was a blur of agony and determination. Elias followed the stars, guiding the mare up the treacherous switchbacks that led to the high country where the Apache remnants had made their camp. He arrived just as the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon, painting the rocks in shades of violent crimson. The settlement was a collection of desperate shelters huddled against a cliff face, poverty etched into every line of the camp. Dogs barked, and an old woman emerged from a hide tent, her face a map of grief and hardship. She held a heavy walking stick like a weapon, blocking his path. "I am looking for Chenoa," Elias rasped, sliding from his horse and holding his hands out to show they were empty of weapons. "She saved my life. I have come to return the favor." The woman stared at him with eyes as hard as obsidian. "You are too late, white man," she spat. "The blow to her back has poisoned her blood. She burns with fever, and the spirits are calling her name." Elias pushed past her, his desperation overriding politeness. "Where is she?" he demanded. The woman pointed to a small, isolated lean-to at the edge of the camp. Elias ducked inside. The smell hit him first, the sickly sweet odor of infection and sweat. Chenoa lay on a pallet of furs, her skin gray and slick, her breathing shallow and rapid. Beside her sat a young girl, no older than 12, wiping her sister's brow with a dry rag. The girl looked up, terrified, but Elias didn't look like a threat. He looked like a man on a mission from God. Elias knelt beside the pallet, his knees cracking on the stone floor. "I'm here," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I've got you." He opened his saddlebag and went to work, his hands steady despite his own condition. He examined her back. The bruise from the rifle butt was a massive, angry purple contusion that had abscessed, sending poison into her bloodstream. It was critical, but not hopeless, if he acted now. He looked at the young girl whose eyes were wide with fear. "What is your name?" he asked softly. "Tala," she whispered. "Tala, I need hot water and clean cloth. Now." As the girl scrambled to obey, Elias uncorked the laudanum. He gently lifted Chenoa's head, trickling the medicine between her cracked lips to dull the pain of what he had to do. He cleaned the wound with surgical spirits, lanced the abscess to drain the infection, and packed it with clean gauze. He worked for an hour, focused and relentless, applying the same field medicine that had kept men alive in the trenches of Virginia. When he was finished, he sat back, exhausted, sweat dripping from his nose. The fever was still high, but the source of the poison was gone. He looked at Tala, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "We can't stay here," Elias said, his voice grave. "The man who did this, he will send riders to finish it. He knows she survived. We need to move her to the high caves." Tala nodded, her jaw setting with a strength that mirrored her sister's. "I will help," she said. Together, the wounded rancher and the Apache child prepared to move the unconscious healer, united by a common enemy and a fragile hope. The journey to the hidden limestone caves was a grueling test of endurance that nearly broke them both. Elias, his heart still fragile and chest aching from the trauma of his collapse, had to lift Chenoa onto his mare, her body limp and burning with the residual heat of the infection. With young Tala guiding the horse by the bridle, they navigated the narrow, crumbling goat paths that wound up into the high serrated peaks overlooking the valley. This was land Elias had scouted decades ago during the Apache Wars, a secret hollow behind a waterfall that fed a small, spring-loaded pool, invisible from the valley floor and defensible against anything but an army. When they finally reached the sanctuary, the sun was high and punishing, baking the rocks into an oven. Elias lifted Chenoa down, his arms trembling with exhaustion, and laid her on a bed of dried moss and blankets near the cool dampness of the cave wall. For the next 24 hours, he didn't sleep. It was the right thing. My grandmother taught that all life is a thread in the same blanket. Silas Vane tried to cut that thread. At the mention of the foreman's name, Elias's expression hardened into granite. He told her everything then. The telegram Mateo had found, the rustlers Silas had invited to pick the bones of the ranch, and the imprisonment of the loyal workers. He spoke of the theft of his land, not just as property, but as a violation of the fragile peace he had tried to maintain in the valley. Chenoa listened in silence, her strength returning with the fiery spark of anger. When Elias finished, he expected her to ask for safety, to remain hidden while he handled the violence to come. Instead, she sat up, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing back, but refusing to lie down again. "He called me a witch," she said, her eyes flashing with dangerous light. "He beat me like a dog and cast me out to die in the dirt. He has taken your home, Elias, but he has insulted my spirit." She looked at him, and the connection between them shifted from patient and healer to soldiers in the same trench. "I know that ranch," she continued. "I have watched it for weeks before I saved you. I know where the shadows fall deep enough to hide a man. I know which floorboards creak on the porch. You have the guns, Elias, but I have the eyes." Elias hesitated, looking at her bandages. "You can barely stand, Chenoa. I can't ask you to fight." She reached out and gripped his forearm, her fingers strong. "You aren't asking. I am telling. We take it back together. For your land, for my honor." Elias looked at her, then at Tala, who was now awake and nodding fiercely. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for a deed to a property. He was fighting for the only people who had shown him loyalty when he was at his weakest. "All right," he nodded, a plan forming in the tactical center of his mind. "We wait one more day for you to gain strength. Then we move. We strike at night." The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky of velvet black when they took their positions on the ridge overlooking Iron Ridge Ranch. Elias lay on his stomach, peering through his father's brass spyglass. The ranch was transformed. It looked less like a home and more like an armed camp. Lanterns hung from the porch of the main house, and armed men, strangers with the slouching posture of career criminals, patrolled the perimeter. He counted 7 hired guns in the yard, plus Silas. The bunkhouse was dark and barred from the outside. That was where Mateo and the loyalists were being held. "The weak point is the east barn," Chenoa whispered, lying beside him. She was moving stiffly, but her stealth was unimpaired. "The guard there is drinking. I can smell the whiskey from here. He sits with his back to the wind." Elias nodded, handing her a box of lucifer matches and a flask of kerosene. "This is the plan," he murmured. "Tala stays here with the horses. She's our lookout. You circle wide to the east. Light the fire. Make it big. Make it bright. Draw them out like moths." He checked the load in his Winchester. "When they run for the fire, I go for the bunkhouse. I free Mateo and the boys. Then we catch Silas in a crossfire." Chenoa took the matches, her face solemn. "And Silas?" she asked. "Is he to be taken alive?" Elias looked down at the ranch, remembering the rifle butt slamming into her spine, the telegram, the betrayal. He holstered his revolver and met her gaze. "Silas Vane forfeited his right to mercy the moment he touched you. He's mine." With a silent nod, Chenoa vanished into the darkness, a wraith of vengeance moving toward the dry timber of the east barn. While Elias began his descent into the shadows of the west, the hammer of his rifle pulled back and ready. At midnight, the eastern sky was torn apart by a sudden, violent eruption of orange light. Chenoa's work was flawless. The dry timber of the hay barn caught the kerosene instantly, the flames roaring upward like a captive dragon released from the earth, throwing long, dancing shadows across the entire valley. Panic rippled through the mercenaries in the yard. "Fire! Get the buckets!" someone shouted, and the discipline of the hired guns shattered as 5 of them sprinted toward the blaze, abandoning their posts to fight the inferno that threatened to consume their pay. This was the opening Elias had been praying for. He moved from the western shadows with the silence of a hunting cougar, slipping past the water tower and coming up behind the lone guard left watching the bunkhouse. The man was distracted, watching the fire, and never heard death coming. Elias didn't use a bullet. He used the heavy brass butt of his Winchester, striking the man at the base of the skull. The guard crumpled without a sound. Elias retrieved the keys from the man's belt and unlocked the heavy padlock on the bunkhouse door. The air inside was thick with fear and stale sweat, but when Mateo saw Elias standing in the doorway, illuminated by the distant firelight, the old vaquero wept openly. "I told them," Mateo whispered, his voice trembling with pride. "I told them the wolf does not die so easily." Elias wasted no time. He passed his pistols and the guard's dropped rifle to Mateo and the two steadiest hands. "The ranch is ours again," Elias said, his voice steel. "But we have to clear the vermin first. Aim true. Don't waste ammunition." The firefight that followed was short, brutal, and decisive. As the mercenaries battled the blaze on the east side, they found themselves caught in a lethal pincer movement. Elias and his liberated crew opened fire from the west, their shots disciplined and accurate. 2 rustlers fell in the first volley, dropping into the dust near the burning barn. The others scrambled for cover behind water troughs and wagons, returning fire blindly into the dark. The night air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of wounded men. Elias moved through the chaos with cold efficiency, advancing from cover to cover, his Winchester cracking rhythmically. He wasn't fighting for land anymore. He was fighting to cleanse his home of the rot Silas had invited in. Within 10 minutes, the resistance crumbled. The surviving mercenaries, realizing they were outflanked and outgunned, threw down their weapons and raised their hands, begging for quarter. But the silence that followed the gunfire was broken by a desperate shout from the main porch. "Stop, or she dies!" Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Silas Vane stood on the raised veranda of the main house. He had spotted Chenoa as she tried to circle back from the barn, and he had been waiting. He had one arm locked around her throat, dragging her backward toward the door, his revolver pressed tight against her temple. Chenoa clawed at his arm, her face a mask of fury rather than fear, but she was still weak from her wounds, and Silas had the leverage of a desperate man. "Drop the guns!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "All of you, or I paint this porch with her brains." Elias signaled Mateo to hold his fire, slowly lowering his rifle until it touched the dirt. He stepped into the light, hands raised, walking steadily toward the porch. "It's over, Silas," Elias said, his voice calm, carrying over the crackle of the dying fire. "Your men have surrendered. The sheriff will be here by noon. There's nowhere to run." Silas laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "I'm not running, Elias. I'm finishing what I started. You ruined this valley. You let these savages and peasants think they were our equals. You polluted everything." He tightened his grip on Chenoa, making her gasp. "I'm going to kill her, then I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to burn this house to the ground with us inside. If I can't have it, no one will." Silas began to cock the hammer of his pistol, his eyes wild with the madness of a man who knows he is already dead. But he had forgotten one thing. He wasn't the only one watching. High on the ridge, young Tala had seen her sister captured. She had raised the heavy buffalo rifle Elias had left with her, a weapon too big for her small frame, and rested it on a rock. She didn't hesitate. A boom like a cannon shot rolled down from the cliffs. The bullet missed Silas's head, but struck the wooden pillar next to him, sending a shower of razor-sharp splinters into his face. Blinded by the debris and shocked by the thunderous noise, Silas flinched violently, his gun hand wavering for a fraction of a second. That was all Chenoa needed. She drove her elbow backward into his stomach with every ounce of strength she possessed, twisting out of his grip as he doubled over. Elias was already moving. He didn't reach for the rifle at his feet. He drew the Bowie knife from his belt and threw it in a single fluid motion. The heavy blade turned once in the air, a silver blur in the firelight, and buried itself deep in Silas's shoulder. The foreman shrieked, dropping his gun and stumbling backward, tripping over his own boots. He fell hard onto the porch floor, scrambling backward like a crab, blood soaking his shirt. He looked up to see Elias standing over him, the rancher's shadow stretching long and dark. Silas gasped, raising a hand as if to ward off a blow. "I did it for the ranch," he whimpered, the bravado gone, leaving only a pathetic cowardice. "I did it for us, Elias." Elias looked down at the man he had once trusted, seeing nothing but a stranger. "You did it for yourself," Elias said quietly. "And there is no us." He kicked the pistol away and signaled for Mateo. "Tie him up. Save him for the hangman. He isn't worth the bullet." 6 months later, the scars on the land had healed. The rains had returned, turning the valley into a lush carpet of green, and the herd was thriving. But the biggest change at Iron Ridge wasn't the cattle. It was the small, whitewashed building that stood near the main gate. It was a clinic stocked with modern medical supplies and traditional herbs. Chenoa stood on the porch of her clinic, watching the sun set over the red cliffs. She wore a clean linen shirt and a skirt of soft deerskin, a badge of her dual role as the ranch's medical officer and a free woman of independent means. Tala sat nearby, reading from a primer, her English improving every day. Elias walked up the steps, dusting his hat against his leg. The stiffness in his chest was gone, replaced by a strength that felt earned. "Sheriff says Silas's trial is set for Tuesday," Elias mentioned, leaning against the railing. "They want you to testify." Chenoa nodded slowly. "I will be there. I will speak the truth." She looked out at the workers, Apache, Mexican and white, working side by side, repairing a fence. "You have built something good here, Elias, better than before." Elias looked at her, and for the first time in years, the ghost of the war didn't haunt his eyes. "We built it," he corrected her, "and we'll keep building it." As the twilight deepened, the wind whispered through the canyon, no longer a sound of loneliness, but a song of endurance. The debt was paid, the past was buried, and for the first time, the future of Iron Ridge belonged to everyone who called it home.